This is the second video presenting Hume's positive account of the origin of our idea of causal connections. In the last video, we saw that there were three component ideas to our idea of cause: contiguity in time and place, priority, temporal priority of the cause to the effect, and the necessary connection between cause and effect. And we went looking for the impression that was the origin of our idea of that necessary connection. And we saw in the example of the billiard balls that we don't have an impression of necessity in just that one instance of the billiard balls. Now, when we were looking at Hume's skeptical argument against the origin of our causal ideas lying in reason, we saw that Hume thinks once we have experience, we do come to believe that there is a necessary connection. So although in one instance, like with Adam and drowning, like with the Adam case, we don't have the impression of a necessary connection. Somehow, once we've gotten experience, once I've drunk water and my thirst has been quenched many times, somehow there comes to be belief in a necessary connection. And so somehow, through having had impressions of past constant conjunctions of drinking water, quenching thirst, drinking water, quenching thirst, of the cause and the effect, it seems like an impression of necessity must arise, and there on its heels comes an idea of that necessity. But why is having past experience so important? I mean, why is it that once I've had this past experience, that the mind starts inferring from the impression of drinking water the belief that my thirst will be quenched? After all, if there isn't the impression of necessity in the first instance, well, it seems like there isn't going to be necessity in the second, right? So it's not clear where this impression of necessity could come from once we've had, repeated instances. So what's going on here? Well, Hume's answer, let's move down a little bit, is going to be custom or habit. So let me switch the examples. In presenting Hume's positive account, I want to use the example of seeing a flame. So you've lit a candle, and you see a flame across the room, or your friend has lit a candle, and you see the flame across the room. And so you're having a present impression of the flame. And when you see the flame, you immediately think, oh, there's heat over there. And so you form this lively idea of heat. Well, so I perceive that the flame comes before the heat, right? And that they're in the same place. So there's contiguity in time and place, and there's temporal priority. So we have two impressions. But if I've never seen flame before, I might not know that there's heat there. And so in order to make this inference, it seems like I need this past experience of where I perceived flame and then I perceived heat. And then I perceived flame and then I perceived heat. I perceived flame and then I perceived heat, right? So, and in each case, there was the flame and then there was the heat. There was the flame and then there was the heat. There was the flame and then the heat. And they were in the same place, right? Flame, heat, flame, heat, flame, heat, all in the same place. So in each case, I got the temporal priority, the impression of temporal priority, and the impression of contiguity in time and place. But as we saw with the billiard balls, well, if there was no impression of the necessity between the flame and the heat in the first case, well, there's not going to be an impression of necessity in any of the subsequent cases. So I can't get my impression of necessity from the flame-heat pairs on their own. Still, Hume thinks having had past experience is important. This constant conjunction, this past experience of the constant conjunction between flame and heat, flame and heat, flame and heat, that is important because it's the constant conjunction that somehow what allows me to start drawing this inference, right? From the flame to the heat. I mean, if I hadn't had any of that past experience, I wouldn't be able to make this inference. But okay, I mean, here we might ask, we start making these inferences once we have that experience of that constant conjunction. But why does the mind start making these inferences on the basis of this? I mean, why is it that somehow, having had the past experience, we start drawing the inferences from the present impression of flame to the lively idea of heat? Well, the first part of Hume's answer is going to be that we form a kind of custom or habit. And so how is this going to work? Well, we've had these constantly conjoined perceptions where each member of the pair resembles a member in the other pair. So the flame resembles the flame, resembles the flame, resembles this impression of flame, and the heat resembled the heat, resembled the heat, resembles the heat that I believe is now there, right? So each part of the pair resembles a member in the other pair. Fire resembles fire, heat resembles heat. And when these encounters happen repeatedly, when I have experience, we find that we start to make this inference when presented with one member of the pair, right? So I'm presented with flame, and so I think heat, right? And so with this past experience, we come to believe that there's a necessary connection. And so the question, well, why would experience of a past constant conjunction bring this idea of necessity, given that the impressions of the single case don't have to do it? What does the experience add? Well, the answer is that Hume proposes is that the experience causes a custom or habit to arise in the mind. So the idea is we've got a custom or habit. The idea is somehow this past experience, right? This past experience. Try that again. This past experience, it somehow causes a custom or habit, which then causes me to start drawing that inference. And notice here, what's above this line here, it's observable. But what's below the line is not observable. What do I mean by observable and not observable? Well, the flame, the impression of the flame and the idea of the heat, or my memory of having seen flame and there being heat there, those are characters on the stage of my mind, right? And these characters, the one appears and then the next and then the next, and so they're perceptions that I have that are on the stage of my mind. I can focus on them and they come before my mind. Whereas the custom or habit That's not a perception. That's not a perception that comes forward on the stage of my mind, right? It's a kind of rule or association, this custom or habit, right? It's a law or a connection that governs when one perception comes forward and then another. One perception comes forward and then another. And so there's something that arises, Hume thinks, through the past experience, on the basis of the past experience, namely this custom or habit, that's not itself observable. It's not itself a perception or a character on the stage of the mind. Nonetheless, it's caused by the past experience. And it's a habit or custom of associating flame or heat, flame or heat, flame or heat. So it's a new relation of association between flame and heat. And you can think of this picture as having temporal dimensions, right? So here we've got what was in the past, and here's the present. And and then into the future. And so as we move from left to right, we're moving forward in time. Everything that's on this side of the line is in the past, is in our memory, and here's the present, and we have the present impression of the flame, and somewhere along the way, in having this past experience of the flame and the heat, something has come to be within my mind, this custom or habit, and the mind has become accustomed to associating ideas that resemble flame and ideas that resemble heat. And it's to the presence of this new habit that Hume appeals when explaining why the mind is now making the inference from my present impression of the flame to this lively idea of heat. And so we can make this constant conjunction here, the cause of this new particular relation of association that now exists in my mind, this new custom or habit. And that new particular relation of association, that new custom or habit, produces the inference that I now make when I encounter the present impression of flame, and I infer the heat. So I come to form the idea of heat before I even put my hand to the flame. I don't need to get an impression of the heat. I have the idea of heat just by seeing the flame across the room, now that I have this past experience, flame, heat, flame, heat, flame, heat. And so the mind is able to make this transition once it's formed this habit. And this habit is based on past experience. If I had never had any experience of this constant conjunction, if I was like Adam, if I'd never had an impression of flame and then felt the heat, impression of flame, then felt the heat, then the impression of the flame would not lead me to the idea of the heat. I might see the flame and think, oh, how beautiful, and reach out and touch it, and thereby gain my first impression of the conjoined sensation of heat. So this habit only comes into being under certain conditions. And this inference only comes to being under certain conditions. And I had to have had the past experience in order to make the inference. Someone who's not had past experience with flame and heat will not have the habit and so not form the inference. So the habit comes into place and thereby makes the inference possible, right, through becoming accustomed. In the next video, I want to turn to the nature of this lively idea of heat. It'll be a shorter video. And so that's what we'll turn to next. So we've got how we get the inference through the custom or habit, or at least a first pass at that. And then in the next video, we'll turn to the nature of the idea that we form on the basis of this